Hello, and welcome to this video on moments of horror in non-horror fiction. I am the laziest writer, and today I'll be taking a look at a few of those instances of films and TV shows from other genres getting involved with my favourite type of tale. I've chosen these as I feel like each does something genuinely interesting with its shift into a new style, but if you have any thoughts and examples that I give, or can think of any other cases, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll make sure to get back to you. And with all of the grovelling out of the way, beware major spoilers ahead for each of the 5 pieces of fiction that I'll be discussing. You can use the chapters in the video description to skip past those spoiler-ridden sections if need be, and let's get straight into example number 1. So for those of you who aren't aware, Misfits was a comedy drama that ran from 2009 to 2013 and was really good for the first 3/5 of that time. It's about a group of young offenders who wind up doing community service as punishment for their various misdeeds, and who are struck by a storm on the first day that gives them each a superpower or ability that is related to, or an enhancement of, the most prominent aspects of each character's personality. Curtis is filled with overwhelming regrets about the life that he threw away, so he can travel back and change the past, whilst Kelly is self-conscious and fears that people are calling her. So she's gifted, or perhaps burdened, with the ability to hear people's thoughts. Kelly starts out as the looks, so to speak, but soon becomes the heart of the show, whilst Nathan offers comic relief through his horrendous jokes and total inability to feel any semblance of shame. But for many of the show's fans, its standout character was Simon, who was simultaneously horrendously creepy and the most sympathetic and understood of this merry band of outcasts. Simon can turn invisible, which reflects both his feelings of being misjudged or overlooked and his subsequent desire to hide away from the world, and ironically is a symptom of the very same thing that leads him to finally finding a group of friends that see him as one of their own. With such a blend of comedy, drama, action and fantasy, it's easy to see why Misfits ticks a lot of boxes throughout the handful of episodes in each series. But there's one specific scene in the first season where the community centre that they're bizarrely bound to becomes a full-blown house of horrors. And that scene is when probation worker Sally finds the proof that the protagonists killed and burned her missing fiancé, who was trying to murder them, but she doesn't know that. This comes at the end of a full 45-minute episode in which she's been falsely flirting with and dating the socially awkward Simon in order to find out more about the events surrounding her would-be husband's disappearance. She does seem to genuinely appreciate Simon's kindness compared to the other miscreants. That's why she targets him after all. But it was always going to end in tears, romantically manipulating the younger man who possibly murdered your partner. She discovers a video on his phone of Nathan blatantly discussing what happened and tries to go to the police, but Simon finds out what's happening, and almost at once flips from the quiet and obedient kid that she knows to something full of rage and ready to engage in violence. I think the reason that this is so effective in this episode is how it's perfectly positioned in both this individual story and in the wider context of the series. Because despite knowing that Simon's a pervert who's at his happiest when getting approval from the others for helping in covering up the 2 killings from the first episode, the group haven't actually killed anyone since the pilot, and we get between 35 and 40 minutes in this episode alone to construct an idea in our heads of Simon as the most sympathetic of the bunch, who's just pleased to finally have some people who want to spend time with him, and to feel like he's finally found his place in this world at last. Even knowing that Sally's only really getting close to him to find out more about the death of her partner Tony, we can't help but fall in line with his hopes that all this is real, and that there's someone who's genuinely interested in him for the first time in his life. Well, other than that one person from the first episode of the second series, but he was terrified of her, so I don't think it counts. And yet it all comes crashing down when Simon's violent side wins out, and even though we might still be desperately hoping that he and his friends don't get caught, it can only be her or them from this point onwards. Simon's power of invisibility has mostly been used for casual shenanigans or general creepiness up until now, and likewise the group haven't really done anything all that malicious. But both of those things are about to change, as Simon horrifies the woman who's only trying to find her fiancé's killers, never delighting in what he feels he has to do, but allowing his rage to ramp up the fear factor and inject sheer terror into her final moments. Smashing the lights like a poltergeist gone mad, he reveals himself to her in the seconds before her death, confirming himself as the irrefutable villain and delivering a sucker punch that shows us beyond doubt that this group of ne'er-do-wells and rapscallions that we've somehow grown to love are actually far, far worse than we ever feared. They are the bad guys, and not just in the Suicide Squad kind of, we're the villains because we're rude and refer to times we killed faceless NPCs, but actually we're the good guys kind of way. They're just genuinely terrible, and consequently most of the people who come across them suffer some degree of punishment, from relentless mockery to straight up murder. And for me that's what was lost a little over time as the series continued. Like, I'm certainly not someone who hates it after series 2 because of the cast changes, but I definitely feel more affinity for the show's dynamic when we had to spend time with the recklessly realistic, self-serving scumbags of the first series, who managed to stay somewhat sympathetic through nothing but unrivaled British young adultness as they steal, snort, smoke, shag, rape, murder, and otherwise stumble through just a few fatal weeks of community service. That first season in particular was so often about the balance between the freedom of an unadulterated good time and the consequences of unchecked hostility. And though I liked Sally, and I am sad about her death in every rewatch, I'm so glad that we got to see this scene from her imperiled perspective, and to witness the series tip over into the horror of what happens when the wrong people get the powers that enhance the worst elements of who they are. The second example that I've chosen to talk about today is the midnight chase scene from No Country for Old Men, in which relentless angel of death Anton Chigurh catches up to everyman anti-hero Llewellyn Moss, who's accidentally taken off with what amounts to about $7 million of Chigurh's money in modern dollars. Well, not accidentally, but he didn't realise at the time that it belonged to this demonic force of evil who would end up killing his family. Until now, these two have never met, and Llewellyn's extreme protective measures and paranoia are the only things that have kept him alive thus far. But once Chigurh has trapped him to the hotel, there's no way that he can escape without coming across the most devastating hitman that doesn't like dressing up as a flamingo. That we know of. I think what's so effective about Chigurh in this film, if you forget the flamingo picture for a minute, is that he's a horror character, introduced through the horrific murders that he commits before terrorizing everyone that he comes across in this relentless stalking of the protagonist, whom he hunts with an overwhelming determination and sheer inevitability that make avoiding confrontation impossible. That's a huge part of why there's so much dread in this scene, which is infused with a tension beyond anything else I can really think of, except this classic moment of television, of course. Everything is enhanced by the darkness in the distance too, as we see Chigurh through his trail of victims, or his shadow under the door, or the glass that shatters and the sparks that fly whilst he shoots at Llewellyn. We're not distracted by his weird hair or choice of clothing. He is at best a shadow that lurks just beyond Llewellyn's comprehension, and at certain points, he is death incarnate.
Drive me on out of here.
His victims never see his face until it's too late, so suddenly we're in their shoes, facing the character that we know by this point to be a monstrous killing machine feared by all who know his name. And I think that Chigurh's bizarre silenced shotgun makes those moments even more terrifying, as it's not something knowable or identifiable. It's not the loud bang of a gunshot that brings out the neighbours and gets the police involved. It's something that fizzes through the air, bringing death without warning and allowing for this entire massacre and chase to take place as the world around Llewellyn sleeps, wholly ignorant of the carnage being wrought upon the streets below. He is nothing like the people that ultimately kill Llewellyn in a drive-by shooting towards the film's end, instead swooping through the night like some petrifying predator that brutally assaults its victims from the skies and their shadows rather than from the barrel of a gun. And that's why this scene has your heart in your throat in an overpowering desire for Llewellyn to survive, more akin to the last half an hour or so of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre than to anything you might find within the genre that No Country for Old Men purports to be a part of. So this next example is from a film that is perhaps the furthest from horror thus far, despite coming from a director who made his name at the helm of one of the best series to ever grace the genre. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2 is often heralded as one of the best superhero films to ever be released, and that's because it bops to high heaven and back through 2 hours and 7 minutes of Peter Parker crying, Dr. Octopus doing evil, and of course,
pizza time.
But for me and many others, the most memorable scene of this extremely iconic movie is when Otto Octavius' bionic limbs really come to life, breaking free of their restraints and taking control of his intense motives to push him beyond the point of no return, aka viciously murdering a whole bunch of doctors on his behalf. The tone of this scene is a far cry from the fun-loving atmosphere of much of Peter's personal life and Spidey-based interactions, instead tearing into its audience with the hitherto unseen brutality of the robotic limbs that seem to relish the opportunity to engage in intense violence for the first time. They could definitely kill a few of those people more quickly, but they instead push their prey around, picking them apart and killing in creative ways that make it into something of an art rather than the horrendously unforgiving slaughter that it is. Even ignoring the Evil Dead references in these two shots that replicate iconic moments of the classic horror franchise, We still get a smorgasbord of quintessential horror motifs that could be overdone genre cliches if it wasn't for the perfection of their execution and the contrast to the much more child-appropriate elements of the rest of the film. The decision to forgo any kind of soundtrack in favour of emphasising the shrill shrieks and muffled screams of these helpless victims helps to inject an atmosphere that takes away any notion of heroics, instead favouring the terror of true hopelessness in the face of something so sadistic and disturbing as these homicidal monsters, born of a genius driven mad as he loses it all. Perhaps the most stark element of Otto's transition from good guy to villain is the charisma and personality of the limbs and his interactions with them, which is really on display through their movements in this scene, sizing up their prey, clamping playfully as they follow their victims to the sites of their deaths, and generally acting and moving in a manner that very quickly goes from understandably defensive, the doctors are trying to kill them after all, to utterly merciless, and then finally to downright cruel. These guys have such a strangely great characterization. They're easily amongst the most alluring robot limbs to ever feature on the big screen, and this is perhaps best shown from their rapport with Dr. Octopus, who is really set up by this scene as it showcases a distinct personality of the limbs themselves, almost polar opposites to the resolute hero of nuclear fusion that Molina's character has been presented as up until this point. Thanks to this moment of horror, we're perfectly poised to watch as those two seemingly incompatible personalities somehow converge into one. The fourth example that I've chosen to look at today is an animated entry from a full-on family film. And no, I'm not talking about the opening scene of Finding Nemo, or even any of the legitimately nightmare-inducing scenes from Sid's house and Toy Story. No, I'm speaking about Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which I'm just realising as I type this that you probably already knew given the whole title screen thing. However, I am incredibly stubborn and I simply refuse to acknowledge the error of my ways. Anyway, there isn't just one specific scene where the horror is ramped up here, but rather a handful of moments scattered throughout the film that come together to provide an impressive horror showing, even in the movie about a claymation funny man whose dog has to rescue him from a crippling cheese addiction. Despite the overall light-hearted tone and child-friendly presentation throughout this movie, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit occasionally throws in some surprisingly chilling and overall disturbing moments, helping to maintain a threat that simmers beneath the surface throughout the entire film. The opening scene features a bit of this, but it's not until after the rabbit brain transfer and the subsequent appearances of Hutch in the Were-Rabbit that things are really ratcheted up into fifth gear. The spookiest of all the gears. We get a glimpse of this as the hulking beast attacks the vicar, at first skulking between the church pews before emerging, never seen except through the fear that it imparts in its victim, which is best realised as it reveals its true height to tower over the poor man. With this, the film goes from bunnies floating funnily through the anti-pesto rabbit rescue tank, to a tale of a creature that stalks the night, devastating the local population and leaving our heroes in the thick of it. Subsequent discoveries are made through similar means, as every scene that brings us a little closer to understanding the nature of the beast is inherently tied to its reign of terror, proving a stark contrast to the bumbling comedy of Wallace's love for Lady Tottington, or the upcoming vegetable competition that so concerns the innocent civilians caught up in this whole mess. Gromit's tailing of the Were-Rabbit and consequent unveiling of the fact that Wallace is the one transforming into the behemoth is a direct result of being left alone in the mist, a sitting duck as Wallace silently disappears into the night. The first time we see the monster up close is a masterful reveal as Gromit tries to get Wallace home before his inevitable transformation. He goes from victim to oppressor as the film's primary antagonists are suddenly dwarfed by the emergence of the creature terrorizing the local townsfolk in a scene surprisingly reminiscent of the beautifully twisted transformation scene from An American Werewolf in London. This is the only other scene which I've ever seen which successfully captures the agony and horror intent in the transformation itself, which is strange as both films are comedies, though perhaps that just means that both moments stand out like the blood-red stains on a black and white canvas of something as silly and cheerful as the rest of their runtimes. Overall, this film has some really effective injections of the horror genre without ever actually succumbing to something that detracts from the gentle and humorous tones of the rest of the Wallace and Gromit films, which is in large part why those instances when it transforms into something darker are so perfect and so palatable to people who aren't normally into kids' films or claymation adventures. Last but not least, we have a scene from the 8th season of the animated adult comedy series Archer. Now, this show has had a bizarre journey over the course of its runtime, with the spy agency turned coke dealers turned gun runners turned CIA assets turned detective agency ending up in a host of unusual settings, genres and scenarios, even well before they did the controversial sci-fi or colonialist adventure seasons. I should probably talk someday about the wider scale of the episodes that take place during the coma that protagonist Sterling Archer finds himself in after the series 7 finale, and particularly how they make use of what might be the show's greatest asset, the best embracing of flanderization that I personally have ever come across. However, today I'm zeroing in on one particular moment from one episode, the Last Supper scene at the end of episode 6 in the LA Noir-esque 1940s detective-themed 8th season. This grotesque moment came as something of a shock in a show that, until this point, had never really gone more than a few moments without one of its inevitable wisecracks, especially given the fact that most of its characters are terrible human beings who do not care one iota about one another's pain. Normally, whenever someone's miserable or terrified, looking at you, Cyril, the other characters are laughing, or exacerbating the issue, or actively trying to sleep with them. We've had 8 years of conditioning to believe that that's what's going to happen. So even when we find Len Trexler sat at the centre of a room of decaying corpses, each viciously contorted and impaled until they resemble one of the figures of the famous painting, and when Barry steps from the shadows to reveal that he's the one behind this deadly recreation, we're still expecting someone to say or do something to alleviate the pressure. We're expecting it, but it never arrives, and the credits roll just after we've realised this, and just before it's been too long and we reach the point at which someone would have to say something. That moment of terror lingers beyond the confines of the episode, hitting extra hard as we're thrown from the comfort of the series' usual running gags and snide remarks, instead left to face the horror of the situation that our heroes find themselves in. Not only does this represent a really intelligent reversal of what we've come to expect of the show after years of training, but it also counteracts the lack of consequence and genuine stakes that come as part of this entire series taking place within the delirious, comatose mind of Sterling Mallory Archer. Saving this sprinkling of horror for this precise moment is perfect timing, as it allows us to be fully engrossed in the moment in a way that we wouldn't otherwise be if the Dream season took the same tone as its predecessors. If things were different, it could be easy to zone out, or say that it doesn't matter, but having this sudden twist to brutality in Archer, which has never really taken the horrific element of death all that seriously, plunges us into both the reality of Archer's deep-lying fears of dying such a meaningless death as those that he himself has killed, and the emotional toll of said deaths, manifested through the terror that his nemesis Barry represents. It's shocking and scary and really very sad, and that's why it can be so effective to have these moments of horror in non-horror fiction. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm really grateful for every view, and if you enjoyed all these minutes of my random nonsense or had any thoughts yourself, I would really appreciate a like or a comment to let me know what I'm doing right and where I'm really going wrong. Sorry about the lack of uploads lately, but if anyone cares, please rest assured that I am working to get part 2 of the Alien video to you as soon as possible. And with that, I will say see you next time.